So I'm starting with this first slide where Paul left off, which is the Daily Mail or the Sunday Mail from yesterday, because I think this really does encapsulate very much the way that the sort of processes at work in the report are very present right this moment. But really what I want to do is to look in more detail at some of the ways that the militarisation that Paul talked about are actually kind of playing out in everyday lives, particularly within education, but also in the sort of public sphere, our kind of civilian society. So just, in fact, Paul's report gives a very detailed, useful understanding and way of looking at militarism as a sort of concept. But I just wanted to pick up three things here as a very short summary of it, just to kind of frame the discussion or what I'm going to be talking about. So militarism is an extension of military culture and influence into everyday life. The normalisation of war and military approaches within our everyday life, and prioritising the needs and interests of military institutions. So I'm going to look at that within education, within central and local government, particularly local government, and within the sort of business, charity and civil society organisations sector. And the report here is the one that Paul mentioned, the National Recognition of the Armed Forces report that was published by the Labour government in 2008. And that recommended 40 measures that would increase visibility, improve contact between the military and the public, build understanding for the armed forces and encourage support for them. Many of which have since come to pass, but not all of them. Just to go into a little bit of detail about the Armed Forces covenants, which Paul mentioned, and how those are kind of playing out today. So we've got the Armed Forces Community Covenant, which basically has two sort of sides to it. So an organisation like a local authority will pledge to and sign a sort of an agreement which basically commits them to two things. The first is to remove disadvantage for their local armed forces community in various services. And the second is to kind of pledge a level of general support for the armed forces through events such as Armed Forces Day, which is coming up later this week. On Saturday is Armed Forces Day. And there's hundreds of events around the country celebrating the armed forces on Saturday. So 100% of local authorities in England, Scotland, and Wales have signed one of these pledges. And this is actually not a local authority. This is Loughborough University, and there they are signing the corporate covenant. And then so often a local authority will appoint someone as an armed forces champion who will basically make sure that the things that the local authority has pledged are actually carried out. And one thing that we've found is that the fact that the local authorities actually sign one of these pledges means that they feel that they have to allow the armed forces to do recruitment activities in public spaces, to have, you know, Armed Forces Day events and other celebratory kind of events. So it's a mechanism that allows this sort of general support to be manifested. Just a couple of images from Liverpool Armed Forces Day last year. They hosted the national event in Liverpool. This year it's in North Wales. And this is the kind of activity that will occur at these events all over the country. Basically, young kids are encouraged to, you know, play with the military hardware. There was a helicopter there, big vehicles, this is just one small snapshot, but there was a lot of activity going on there. Again, from last year, I think Staffordshire County Council doing something which a lot of local authorities are doing, which are encouraging their employees and anyone else to salute our forces in a kind of random, generic, supportive way. A little bit meaningless, but on the other hand, creating this sense of, you know, everyone supports the armed forces and what they do. The other thing is the corporate covenants. This is a little bit sort of further behind in its sort of development, but currently 2,000 companies, charities, other organisations have signed one of these pledge agreements, partnership kind of agreements with the armed forces in their locality. Including lots of education institutions. This one here is from the Academy's Enterprise Trust. And in the things that they've pledged, which you can see in that list there, you can see things that are measures which are about sort of supporting the local armed forces, you know, service children or people who are in the reserves, veterans, military spouses. So sort of enabling people within the armed forces community to access what everyone else has access to. But also there's a sense in which they are going beyond that and they're supporting initiatives that actually promote the armed forces, just in this very generic way, military ethos in schools, cadets, and Armed Forces Day. This is probably a bit difficult to read, actually. But this is really about the one of the, I think, the key reasons, the sort of raison d'etre for the corporate covenants. It's very much about recruiting reserves from civil society. There's a big emphasis on recruitment of reserves rather than regulars now, which is the armed forces strategy, but there's a big problem in that it's very difficult to get the numbers as it is just generally in terms of recruiting anybody. So a lot of emphasis is going on encouraging employers to sort of bring those people forward and when those people have come forward to support those people in doing their reserve activities. And one thing that is happening is the MOD have set up this Defence Employer Recognition Scheme, which gives awards to employers, a bronze award, a silver award, a gold award if you're lucky enough, if you're good enough, if you supported the armed forces well enough, you get a gold award by the MOD. And this example in the box, which is from the latest Armed Forces Covenant annual report, is from the Department for Work and Pensions, who are doing all they can to support the armed forces. They are channeling people from the job centres into recruitment initiatives, and they are training up staff within the job centres to do that work. Yeah, there's more to say there, but it, so moving on to education, this is an area that we look at in some detail. And this image actually is from our resource pack, Take Action on Militarism. So if you can't read the detail here, you can read it in the resource pack. And this is really all the ways in which the military is being promoted to young people within the education system. And I'm going to just touch on some of those in more detail, but I just wanted you to get a sense of the kind of numerous ways in which that's happening. So they've long been doing careers visits to schools and colleges, and this is one example of that. In 2012, the MOD published what they called a youth engagement review, which kind of basically sets out why they do this work, what the defence rationale is for doing that work, and you know, improvements that can be made. And their main purpose is about recruitment. Inevitably, recruitment is actually behind everything. All this engagement is about recruitment. The second reason is really to create what they call a positive awareness of the armed forces amongst the young generation, who are going to be those, you know, the people who grow up to be voting, taking decisions, having, you know, an understanding of the armed forces, which will affect the operational constraints that Paul talked about in future years. But they also do recognise a kind of a way in which they can feed into the student development agendas that the Department for Education or schools themselves would have, and that's mainly through cadets and those kinds of activities. These two quotes here are very interesting because there's this big sort of dispute, in a sense, that we have and others with the MOD about what actually goes on in schools, and we say it's a recruitment activity and therefore should not be happening within the schools, and schools should not be enabling this to happen. They deny it and say, oh, we don't sign anyone up in a school, therefore it's not recruitment. And yet their very own, 10 years ago, their very own head of recruitment actually said in I think that was published in the New Statesman, that their approach is to sort of wheel young people in drip by drip by drip with a little bit of, you know, something to spark the imagination, and then they'll give them a bit more information. And in this way, they will sort of bring them in, and by the time they're 16, 17 or 18, they'll be ready to join up. And we call that recruitment, but they don't. Another big area that's developed is military ethos in schools. This is from the Department for Education. It's not even an MOD initiative. From 2012, lots of funding, lots of different aspects, particularly the cadet expansion scheme, which is actually, unfortunately, expanding the cadets quite significantly in the state school sector. Also, what they call alternative provision with the military ethos, and this is particularly aimed at young people who are at risk of failing the sort of mainstream system. These are some examples. This private company called Commander Joe's, which run activities for whole school or whole class activities, and the branding is very militarized, although not all the activities are. Another one here called Challenger Troop, and this is from their website, and they talk about military ethos. They refer to General Dannett saying how the values of the military are about character and spirit, and somehow making those military values unique to the military, instead of actually just ones that are for, you know, that any decent person would want to lay claim to in some respect. And this is a tweet of an activity that they did in a school. I think it's a primary school. And they're all dressed in combat gear, so very militarised. There's lots of narratives about why the sort of military should be going into schools. One of them is their sort of ability, unique ability even, to solve social problems, even though, you know, they've only got one approach. But this is an example of that, and it's obviously often something that the media will pick up on. And other examples, how only the army could help the kids in this particular school. This is around fun and fitness, and this one here is around the idea that the military ethos builds character. And that was very much the flavour of the month a couple of years ago with the Education Secretary. Another big area that we're seeing is how the military, because they are very focused around engineering and technical developments, are zooming in on certain forms of education, particularly technology education, careers-led education, and kind of trying to monopolise those areas to some degree. So one area that we've been researching recently is university technical colleges, which there are about 50 of those around the UK, and they specialise in education for the older secondary age group, and sort of mix careers and academic education. And about half of those institutions are partnered or sponsored in some way by either part of the military or arms companies, and often a number of those entities. This is actually the most extreme example, Wiltshire, South Wiltshire University Technical College, and obviously it's a very militarised area anyway, but this education institution is sponsored by all of these companies and parts of the armed forces, and the ones that are bolded are the ones which are military interests. So you've got 5 arms companies and all three services. Yeah, that's quite an extreme example, but about half of those institutions are influenced by the military in some way, or military interests. A number of them are actually affiliated to the Royal Navy. I'm going to have to get on. And the other big area is through the provision of STEM education. And again, that's very... there's a lot of emphasis put on that by the Department for Education, because obviously it's about the future of British industry, and it's about attainment and careers for young people. And the military, including arms companies, have seen this as a big opportunity to get involved. And these are just some of the ways in which some of the sort of programs and schemes that they are have devised to take into schools, and obviously they provide these resources and activities for free, and it's a way, very much a way to influence young people within the education system. So I just wanted to very quickly look at what's enabled this, particularly within education, what's enabled this change over the last 10 years. And as Paul has talked about, there's obviously been a big shift in civil-military relations, and that has sort of prepared the ground for this encroachment to happen. But also there's been a fragmentation within the education system itself, and sort of government emphasis has changed towards careers and technical education. And I think it's important to sort of understand that wider context to see why this is happening. It's not just about the military, in a sense. There are other actors and there are other things necessary, I think, for this change to have happened. And in terms of what this actually results in terms of sort of the experience of education on the ground as a young person, military interests have obviously become more structurally embedded within education, and so there's a conflict there, I think, between the interests of defence and the interests of education, and those agendas which are obviously not necessarily compatible in any sense, and of course commercial interests as well. They're channeling students down a very narrow path. Once they're in the university technical colleges, for example, they're channeled towards certain industries, yet in a way society needs young people to be looking more broadly away from the military and away and towards other industries that need their expertise. And it's the same with the way that the military is influencing research in universities, and this is a big problem within universities as well, and I haven't even touched on that. But also the state is subsidising the needs of the employer by focusing on giving the military what it wants from education, and I think that there's a question there about you know, whether that's acceptable. And of course, there's a whole range of ethical issues around this, which, you know, we could discuss for a long time. But I think one of the things that's really the main thing is that this has happened very much on a sort of in a stealthy way, without scrutiny, without much public debate, and it's something that I hope that the publication of the report and the sort of understanding the wider context in which this development has happened will uncover a bit more.
Thank you.